The stagecoach rattled to a halt in a town that had no welcome for her. Dust clung to her skirts, the sky pressed down heavy and gray, and in her arms she carried a trunk with nothing but hope and a folded wedding dress. But no one stepped forward. No hand reached for hers. The man who had called her across the plains was nowhere to be found. And in that silence, thick with stares and whispers, the bride who had come so far found herself abandoned, before she had even begun. The stagecoach rolled in with the weary groan of wood and iron, its wheels carving deep scars through the rutted street. Dust rose like smoke in its wake, clinging to everything it touched, the horse trough outside the saloon, the warped boards of the mercantile, the sun-bleached sign that read simply Post. It gathered, too, in the folds of the skirts of the lone woman who stepped down from the coach. She carried no chaperone, no companion. Only a battered trunk and, folded within it, a wedding dress stitched in better days. Her name was Eleanor Harrow, though in this town she was no one yet. She had traveled 5 days through wind and distance, believing herself awaited. She had studied the careful letters of a man who promised steady work, a roof, and perhaps, if time and mercy allowed, a place in his heart. She stepped down, adjusting the shawl around her shoulders, and searched the crowd for the face she had come to meet. But no one moved toward her. The coachman tugged his hat, muttered something about schedules, and drove off, leaving her in the hush of staring eyes. The sun hung like a hammer above the street. No greeting met her, no strong hand reached for her trunk. Only silence, broken by the creak of a swinging sign and the faint rustle of skirts as a woman across the street pulled her child closer, as though Eleanor carried some quiet shame. Eleanor stood for a moment, her fingers tightening on the worn handle of her trunk. She told herself perhaps he was late. Perhaps he had been caught with cattle or delayed by weather. But the stillness around her held a heavier truth. Her groom-to-be had chosen absence. The saloon doors swung once, revealing faces pressed close with curiosity, then shut again as though to bar her from warmth. The boarding-house matron leaned from her porch with a look that held no welcome, only a measured judgment. 2 boys ran past, whispering and snickering, the bride no one came for. Her cheeks burned, though she lifted her chin. Pride, though thin, was all she had left. She gathered her trunk and took one step toward the boarding house when she heard it, small footsteps, hesitant, then sure. She turned to see a child standing not 3 paces away, no older than 6 or 7. The girl's dress was plain calico, patched at the knees, her hair tied in 2 uneven braids that brushed her shoulders. But her eyes, large, solemn, unguarded, fixed on Eleanor with a weight far older than her years. The girl reached out her hand, small fingers spread as though she could anchor them both against the wind that swept the street. Eleanor blinked, unsure. But in that gaze she saw not pity, nor the cruel amusement she had glimpsed in others. She saw loneliness, raw and unhidden. From the corner of her vision, Eleanor became aware of a figure leaning against the hitching post near the blacksmith's. A man, broad-shouldered and weathered, with scars half hidden beneath the shadow of his hat. He stood apart, as though distance had become his only companion. His eyes, though narrowed, followed the child, watched the hand she extended, watched Eleanor hesitate. The girl spoke softly, her voice nearly lost in the wind. "You look cold." It was not cold, heat shimmered in waves from the hard-packed earth, but the words pierced through nonetheless. Eleanor, throat dry, gave a small nod. The girl slipped her hand into hers, warm and firm. It was an act of mercy, though the child might not have known it. The man did not move closer, though his hand twitched once near the brim of his hat. Eleanor guessed, in some wordless way, that he was the girl's father. His stillness was not indifference, but restraint, an instinct to watch rather than to reach. His silence said much, a man familiar with grief, one who had learned the cost of hope. The boarding-house matron cleared her throat, breaking the moment. "Rooms upstairs if you've got coin," she said. Her tone carried no kindness, only business. "But mind you, we've no place for lingerers." Eleanor inclined her head, her pride stiffening her back though her hands shook as she carried her trunk inside. The girl followed a step, as though unwilling to let go, until her father murmured her name, Clara, and she stopped. Up the narrow stairs, Eleanor found a room with a single bed, a cracked basin, and a window that looked out over the dusty street. She set her trunk at the foot of the bed and sat, her hands folded tight in her lap. The dress inside the trunk seemed to breathe in the silence, a reminder of what she had carried all this way. She did not weep. Her tears had been spent in the months before, when the letter first came and she dared to believe her life might change. What filled her now was something colder, shame, yes, but also a weary clarity. She had been abandoned, and yet she must endure. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. The murmur of the town carried upward, boots on wood, laughter from the saloon, the faint clatter of hammers from the smithy. Life went on, indifferent to her arrival. But she remembered the girl's hand, small and warm in hers. A gesture simple and unguarded, yet it lingered longer than the shame. Eleanor Harrow had come seeking a husband, a home, a place to lay her burdens. What she found instead was silence, suspicion, and a child's fragile trust. She drew her shawl tighter, whispering to the empty room, "I will not be broken." And though no one heard, the words carried weight enough to keep her upright against the gathering dusk. The room Eleanor rented was narrow and spare, its walls yellowed by the smoke of other lives that had come and gone. The bed sagged in the middle, and the wash basin leaked a thin line of rust into the corner. Yet she kept it neat. Each morning she folded her shawl at the foot of the bed, set her trunk square against the wall, and tucked her wedding dress at the bottom as though pressing a ghost beneath the lid. She could not bring herself to look at it long, but neither could she cast it away. Some relics cling even when they wound. She earned her bread in quiet ways. The boarding-house matron discovered she was deft with a needle, and soon shirts, trousers, and torn shawls were brought to her. Eleanor worked by lamplight, the silver thread catching the glow, her fingers steady. It was labor she had known since childhood, the kind that did not speak but whispered. With each stitch she bought another day of survival. Still, whispers followed her. The bride no one came for. They said it at the mercantile when she bought coffee grounds and soap. They said it on the boardwalk when she passed the saloon. The words brushed against her like burrs, small, sharp, impossible to ignore. She carried them as she carried her dress, hidden but felt. On the edge of town, Jonas Kincaid labored alone. His ranch stretched wide beneath the hills, but it was marked more by silence than by bounty. He kept cattle enough to scrape by, tended his horses, mended his fences. His hands were hard, his back bent with work. The rocking chair on the porch, however, he could not touch. It had belonged to his wife, Anna, and after the storm took her, he left it where it was. Some evenings, after Clara slept, he would sit on the steps beside it, unable to occupy its space, as though the wood itself still bore the shape of her absence. He was a man who knew the weight of quiet. Scars crossed his temple, running down to his jaw, reminders of a fire years before. He did not speak of them, nor of the storm that had swept through the valley and stolen the woman he loved. His grief was carried in silence, and he believed silence would keep him upright. But Clara was not made for silence. The child, with her uneven braids and wide gaze, found her way to Eleanor's room when she could. She would knock politely once, then slip inside as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Eleanor would look up from her stitching to find the girl perched on the chair, chin in her hands, watching. "Why's the dress never worn?" Clara asked one afternoon, tilting her head at the trunk. Eleanor's needle paused. The lamplight trembled in the draught from the window. She considered the question, then set her work aside. "Because the man who asked me to wear it changed his mind," she said gently. Clara frowned. "That's foolish. It's a fine dress." Eleanor gave a thin smile. "Perhaps it was never meant to be mine." The child thought on this, then said with the bluntness of youth, "My papa still keeps Mama's chair. He doesn't sit in it." Just looks at it. Maybe that's the same as your dress. Eleanor blinked, her throat tightening. Children had a way of cutting straight to truths adults circled around. She reached out and smoothed one of Clara's braids. Maybe so. In these visits, fragments of the past stirred. Jonas would come home to find Clara with a mended shawl draped over her shoulders, her hair braided neatly by Eleanor's careful hands. He would watch from the doorway, silent, as Eleanor hummed an old tune while she worked. For a moment, the cabin seemed warmer. Yet the sight pierced him, too. It looked like something once lost, returned in shadow. He would step back into the night air, unwilling to intrude on what felt fragile as spun glass. Eleanor, alone at her lamp, would remember her own beginnings. A father gone to debt, a mother to illness, the house sold to strangers. She remembered the sting of rejection when letters to distant kin went unanswered, the hollow of hunger that drove her west. Poverty had taught her shame early, and abandonment sealed it. She told herself she came here for survival, not for love. And yet when Clara leaned against her side, warm and trusting, something stirred in her chest that she had buried long ago. Jonas, too, could not keep his memories buried. The storm returned in flashes, the sudden black sky, the roar of water sweeping down from the hills, Anna's hand torn from his in the rush. He recalled the endless silence afterward, the rocking chair unmoving by the hearth, Clara's small body curled in sleep while he sat awake, staring at the emptiness. He carried guilt like a brand, that he had not held tighter, that his silence had starved his daughter of a mother's warmth. And yet Clara, with her insistence, wove threads between them. She carried mended shawls from Eleanor's hands to Jonas's cabin, proudly declaring that Miss Eleanor made it better. She sat on the floor while Eleanor braided her hair, then ran home to show her father, her eyes shining. Piece by piece, in her small offerings, she bound their lives together without knowing she was doing it. One evening, as the sun bled red across the plains, Jonas stood at his fence and watched Clara skipping across the yard with a shawl around her shoulders. It was patched with neat stitches, strong and fine. He looked at the rocking chair then, its silence pressing on him. Slowly, he placed his hand on the worn wood. It did not break him. It did not take her from him again. It was simply a chair, waiting. In town, Eleanor folded her dress once more into the trunk, but this time she pressed Clara's ribbon between its folds. It did not erase her shame, but it softened it. Two broken pasts, separate as dust and rain, had begun to bend toward one another. Neither spoke of it. Neither dared. But in the quiet rhythm of needle and braid, in the stillness of a rocking chair touched again, the first fragile bridge was laid. The storm announced itself long before it broke. All afternoon the sky had darkened, a bruised purple pressing down upon the plains. The cattle grew restless, lowing in unease, the chickens tucked their wings and went silent. Dust whipped into the air, then fell back in sudden gusts that rattled loose boards and sent shutters banging. By evening, the horizon boiled with black clouds, stitched by thin veins of lightning. Jonas Kincaid knew the signs. He saddled his horse and rode into town, needing flour, salt, and nails before the storm closed the roads. Rain struck him before he reached the first lamplight, fat drops that stung his face, driven sharp by the rising wind. The town huddled beneath the coming sky. Merchants shuttered their doors, women gathered children inside, lamps burned low behind glass. Jonas tied his horse outside the mercantile, hat pulled low, and stepped into the dim interior. That was when the shouting began. It came from the saloon, angry, desperate, the voice of a man with nothing left but fury. Jonas stiffened, hand drifting instinctively toward the rifle slung across his back. Inside the saloon, a drifter had taken shelter from the storm. His clothes were soaked, his eyes wild. In his hand glinted a pistol, wavering from face to face. The barkeep stood frozen, a glass half polished in his grip. Patrons pressed against the far wall, trapped between fear and the man's erratic rage. Jonas did not move at once. He stood in the doorway, rain dripping from his hat brim, watching. His silence was not hesitation but measure. He had seen men like this before, the kind who mistook noise for power. Outside, the storm broke in earnest. Rain hammered the roof, and thunder rolled close enough to shake the windows. Lightning flared, white and sharp, casting the scene in momentary starkness. On the boardwalk, Eleanor Harrow clutched her shawl tight against the downpour. She had ventured out for kerosene before the skies turned black, and now she found herself caught in the open. Beside her, Clara clung to her skirts, eyes wide. The storm terrified her, but Eleanor feared more than thunder. She heard the shouting spill through the saloon doors, saw the flash of steel in the drifter's hand when the doors swung. Without pause, she took Clara's hand and pulled her toward the mercantile, seeking shelter. The child stumbled, nearly falling, but Eleanor's grip was strong, steady. She did not falter, even as the rain soaked her through, plastering her shawl to her shoulders and stringing her hair across her face. She pushed Clara ahead of her, into the shadowed doorway, shielding her with her own body. Jonas, inside, caught sight of them through the rain-streaked glass. Eleanor's figure was framed in lightning, fragile yet unyielding, a woman who had known abandonment but refused to surrender. The drifter swung his pistol toward the window, toward the movement outside. Fear widened the townsfolk's eyes. That was when Jonas stepped forward. He unslung his rifle in one smooth motion, the wood familiar against his palm, the iron cool against his cheek. His voice was low but steady, carrying through the storm and the silence alike. "Put it down." The drifter turned, laugh ragged, teeth flashing. "You'll shoot me dead for standin' where I please." Jonas did not blink. Rainwater slid down his scarred face, dripping onto the floorboards. The thunder outside seemed to wait. "One chance," Jonas said simply. The man's gaze flicked from Jonas's eyes to the rifle barrel, then back. He spat to the side, a gesture more weary than defiant. At last, with a curse muttered beneath his breath, he lowered the pistol and dropped it onto the table. The tension broke like a snapped rope. The barkeep let out the breath he'd been holding. Patrons sagged against the wall, murmuring thanks under their breath. Jonas gave no reply. He lowered his rifle, collected the pistol, and slid it across the bar. "Keep it." The storm still raged when he stepped outside. Rain poured in silver sheets, soaking his coat, plastering his hair to his brow. Eleanor stood with Clara pressed to her side, the child's face buried against her skirts. Eleanor's shawl dripped, heavy with water, but her posture was unbent, her gaze steady on Jonas as though measuring the man she had only glimpsed before. Their eyes met. For a moment, the storm was not around them but between them, silent, electric, dangerous. Jonas looked at Clara, trembling but safe beneath Eleanor's hand. Something inside him shifted. He saw not shame, not abandonment, but strength. Steel, quiet and unflinching. "Come," he said at last, his voice nearly lost in the downpour. "You'll not walk back through this." He led them to his wagon, pulling a blanket from beneath the seat and wrapping it around Clara's small shoulders. Eleanor climbed in after her, rain streaming from her dress, her shawl clutched around her. Jonas guided the horse through the storm, wheels groaning through the mud, until the dark outline of his cabin rose from the plains. Inside, warmth met them, fire already laid, coals coaxed to life by Jonas's practiced hands. He hung Eleanor's shawl by the hearth to dry, the fabric steaming as it drank in the heat. Clara curled in Eleanor's lap, lulled by the storm's roar outside and the fire's crackle within. Jonas sat across from them, rifle propped beside the door, his gaze fixed on the flames. He did not speak, but his silence was different now, less of a wall, more of a weight shared. Eleanor smoothed Clara's damp hair, humming softly under her breath. The firelight painted her face in gold, softened the sharpness of her features, and Jonas felt something stir deep within him, something he had buried with the rocking chair, with the storm that had taken Anna. Admiration, reluctant yet undeniable. Outside, the storm raged on, but within those walls a fragile shelter held. The storm passed, but its echo lingered. The plains stretched wide and washed clean, the sky a pale, forgiving blue, yet in Jonas's cabin the air remained taut as a drawn wire. Eleanor stayed on, not by invitation spoken aloud but by necessity unchallenged. The road back to town was a mire, and Jonas did not ask her to leave. She woke each morning to the smell of strong coffee and damp wood, the hush of Clara's small feet padding across the floor, and Jonas's figure already outside, shoulders bowed to his chores. She did what she could, quietly. Her hands found work in mending, shirts with frayed cuffs, socks riddled with holes, old blankets worn thin by years of use. She scrubbed dishes with quick, practiced motions, swept the hearth, and coaxed warmth into the cabin with her quiet industry. The rocking chair creaked as she passed it, a sound that seemed to watch her as much as Jonas did. Jonas, for his part, kept his distance. He nodded at her work, thanked her in clipped words, but more often he slipped into silence, as though too much speech might unravel something tightly wound inside him. Yet he noticed her steadiness. The way she stirred stew without waste, the way she pressed Clara's hair into neat braids, the way her laughter, soft, reluctant, spilled like a stream long dammed when Clara made some small jest. Clara thrived. She laughed more in those days than she had in months. She carried kindling with earnest pride, helped Eleanor hang damp laundry by the fire, begged each evening for her hair to be braided before bed. When Eleanor's gentle hands parted her hair, Clara's eyes shone in the firelight, and Jonas felt a pang so sharp it startled him, not jealousy, not even grief, but the ache of something he thought had died in him, the longing for warmth within his home. Yet beneath it ran unease. Eleanor was not wife, nor mother, nor kin. Her presence was both balm and burden, her nearness a comfort that cut too close. Jonas felt it whenever she brushed past him in the narrow space, whenever her shawl slipped from the peg and he bent to hand it back, fingers brushing fabric still carrying her warmth. The town did not let them forget. When Jonas went for supplies, he heard the talk. Men with whiskey on their breath muttered about the bride no one came for, about how Jonas had taken her in, about how long until charity turned to something else. Their words were crude, careless, meant to wound. Jonas said little, but his jaw tightened, and his fists curled until the knuckles whitened. He did not strike them, but the restraint cost him. Eleanor, too, heard the whispers. When she ventured into town, women stared at her as though she carried scandal in her shawl. Some looked away quickly, but others let their disapproval show plain. She bore it with her chin high, though at night she folded her dress deeper into the trunk, as though to bury the shame that followed her. One evening, rain pattered gently on the roof, softer than the storm that had driven her here, but insistent enough to keep them close around the fire. Clara had fallen asleep curled in Eleanor's lap, her hair in tidy braids, her hand clutching Eleanor's sleeve as though afraid to let go even in dreams. Jonas sat at the table, oiling his rifle. His hands moved with practiced rhythm, cloth against steel, the smell of gun oil mingling with smoke from the fire. The lamplight painted his scars in sharp relief, each line a story left untold. Eleanor watched him from the hearth, her hand resting lightly on Clara's back. Their eyes met across the room. For a long moment neither looked away. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. The rain tapped steady on the roof, a rhythm older than words. Eleanor's gaze softened, though her face remained composed. She saw in him not just a scarred rancher, but a man shouldering silence heavier than any storm. Jonas, in turn, saw her not as the abandoned bride the town whispered about, but as a woman who had stood unflinching in rain and danger, who had taken his daughter's hand as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Still, the distance held. Words trembled at the edge of speech but did not cross. Both knew the cost of loss, the danger of hope. Healing, they understood, required risk. And risk was something neither dared, not yet. Jonas set the rifle aside, his eyes lingering a breath longer on Eleanor before he stood. He pulled Clara gently from her lap, carried the sleeping child to her small bed, and laid her down with a tenderness that caught Eleanor off guard. When he returned, he paused at the rocking chair, his hand resting on its back. The chair creaked softly, an echo of memory. He let it stand, untouched, and crossed the room. Eleanor rose, gathering her shawl from the peg, and draped it around her shoulders. The room was warm, but she shivered all the same. Jonas opened his mouth as though to speak, then closed it again. His silence was not cold, but careful, like a man standing at the edge of a river he was not ready to cross. The rain deepened, steady and sure. The fire burned low, shadows climbing the walls. Eleanor turned toward her narrow bed, Jonas toward the dying embers, and between them stretched a silence heavy. The wind carried dust down the single street of town, skimming past boot heels and wagon wheels, stinging eyes unprepared for its bite. Eleanor had come only for thread and flour, Clara skipping beside her with a ribbon trailing from her braid. It should have been an ordinary errand, a small rhythm in a fragile piece. But words, careless and sharp, are swifter than any wind. A man leaned against the rail outside the mercantile, hat tilted low, whiskey heavy on his breath though the day was barely begun. His eyes found Eleanor, lingered on the child at her side, and he let slip a laugh that cut like glass. "Bride no one came for," he drawled. "Best mind your girl, else she'll end up the same." Clara stiffened, small hand tightening around Eleanor's. Shame flushed Eleanor's cheeks, but before it could settle, something in her, something forged in the miles she had walked and the silences she had borne, rose like iron from the earth. She turned, her voice quiet yet steady, every word shaped like stone. "You will not speak of her that way. Nor of me." The man smirked, readying some crueler retort. But the sound of boots on dust broke through. Jonas Kincaid stood a pace away, shoulders squared, fists already clenched. The scar down his cheek caught the sun, stark against the fury in his eyes. "That's enough," he said, low and certain. The townsman sneered. "You've taken her in, then? Widowmaker playing the hero?" Jonas stepped forward. His voice did not rise, yet it carried the weight of a storm on the horizon. "Another word, and I'll put you in the dust you're so fond of spitting." The man shifted, gauging the silence that had fallen over the street. No one moved to back him. Jonas's fists flexed once more, and the decision was made. The townsman spat sideways, muttered, and slunk off down the road, boots dragging through dirt. For a breath, the street remained still. Eleanor's hand trembled where it held Clara's, but her chin was high. Jonas glanced at her, his gaze not lingering yet not fleeing. Then he turned, leading them wordlessly to the wagon waiting at the edge of town. The ride back was silent save for the creak of wheels and the soft snort of the horse. Clara pressed close to Eleanor, eyes heavy with confusion and trust. Eleanor sat rigid, hands folded in her lap, but her heart pounded with the words she had spoken and the ones she had swallowed. Jonas drove, his profile carved against the setting sun, jaw tight as stone. Back at the cabin, the silence clung like smoke. Jonas unharnessed the horse with sharp, efficient movements, while Eleanor lit the lamp inside, her shawl slipping from her shoulders. Clara settled near the hearth, weary from the day, her small form wrapped in a blanket. When Jonas finally entered, the firelight caught on the rifle above the mantel, on the old chair in its shadow, on Eleanor standing still as though rooted by the weight of her own breath. "I will not be pitied," she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the hush. Jonas looked at her, startled not by the words but by their force. "I crossed half this country," she continued, her hands trembling though she held them firm, "to stand waiting in a station for a man who never came. I carried a dress meant to make me belong, and it lies at the bottom of my trunk like a shroud. I have been whispered about, laughed at, and named unwanted. But I will not," her voice broke, then steadied. "I will not let shame teach Clara she is less than whole. The fire cracked, throwing sparks against the iron grate. Jonas set his hands against the table, leaning as though the weight of her truth pressed against his own chest. "I thought my grief was mine to carry alone," he said at last, voice rough as gravel. "When the river took my wife, I told myself I should have done more. Tied the rope tighter. Held her longer. I let that guilt fill this house until there was no room for Clara. Or for me." His gaze lifted, finding hers across the firelight. "You stood against him today. I've not had that kind of strength in years." The words hung between them, raw and spare. Eleanor turned, pulling her shawl from the chair where it had fallen, and draped it over the fire's edge to dry. Jonas's eyes followed the motion, then drifted past her to the old rocking chair. It stood unmoved, a sentinel of memory, each creak a reminder of absence. Slowly, hesitantly, Jonas crossed the room. His hand gripped the arm of the chair, and for the first time in years, he shifted it. Not out the door, not into shadow, but simply aside, to make space where once there had been none. Eleanor's breath caught, though she said nothing. From the hearth, Clara stirred, blinking sleepily. She lifted her face toward Eleanor, then toward her father, her small voice carrying with the honesty only a child could bear. "You want a home," she murmured, words slurred with sleep, "and I want a mommy." The silence that followed was not empty. It was alive, tender, perilous, fragile as a flame. Eleanor bent, smoothing Clara's hair where the braid had loosened. Jonas remained by the chair, his scar catching the light, his eyes fixed not on the fire but on the woman who had brought warmth back into its glow. No vows were spoken. No promises bound. But the air had changed, charged with something deeper than survival. The fire between them no longer burned against, but for. The morning broke pale and thin, the sky a wash of gray before the sun had strength enough to burn through. Eleanor moved quietly about the cabin, setting the kettle upon the stove, folding Clara's shawl across the chair. The girl still slept in the loft, her soft breathing steady, while Jonas worked outside, splitting kindling in slow, even strokes. The air carried the scent of wet earth, remnants of last night's rain. Peace had become a fragile thread in their lives, delicate as the smoke rising from the chimney. Eleanor knew better than to take it for granted. And so, when the knock came upon the door, sharp, demanding, her body stiffened as though the sound were a blade drawn. She opened the door to find him. Henry Dobbs, the man whose letter had summoned her across half the continent, stood upon the porch. His hat was crushed between his hands, though his posture bore more anger than shame. The years had not been kind, whiskey lined his face, and bitterness hollowed his eyes, but she knew him at once. "Eleanor," he said, as though the name were a claim. "You came for me, and I reckon it's time you keep your word." The trunk in her room seemed to breathe behind her, its hidden dress stirring like a ghost at his voice. For a moment, her knees threatened to give way. Then she straightened, fingers clutching the doorframe until her knuckles blanched. "My word," she said softly. "You left me standing in the dust. Whatever promise there was died there." His jaw hardened. "I was a fool, I admit it. But I've a farm to keep, and a man alone makes poor work of it. You're here, and folk already talk. Better we do what was meant." The gall of it struck her like a lash. This man who had abandoned her now spoke of respectability, as though she were no more than a tool to mend his reputation. Before she could answer, boots sounded behind her. Jonas stepped into the doorway, the axe still in his hand, his presence filling the space like stone fills a riverbed. He did not lift the blade, nor speak first, but his silence bore its own weight. Dobbs bristled, eyes narrowing. "This isn't your matter, Kincaid. The lady answered my letters. She's bound to me." Eleanor trembled, but her voice did not falter. "I am bound to no man who casts me aside like refuse. You forfeited any claim the day you turned your back." Jonas's gaze never left hers. Steady, unyielding, he stood not before her but beside her, as though his very stillness said, "Your words are enough." I am only here to witness. Dobbs's face darkened, shame twisting into cruelty. You think anyone else would want you? You're marked now. Best take what's offered before you've nothing. Eleanor's hand shook, but she lifted it between them, palm outward like a shield. I came across the plains for a chance at belonging. I found shame instead. But hear me, Henry Dobbs, I will not wear it another day. You cannot barter with what you cast away. I am not yours. The word struck harder than any blow. Dobbs faltered, then spat upon the porch, his pride collapsing where his claim had failed. With a curse under his breath, he jammed his hat upon his head and stalked toward the road, dust rising with each step until he vanished into the wide silence of the plains. When he was gone, Eleanor sagged against the doorframe. Jonas set the axe aside and, for a long moment, said nothing. The fire in the hearth behind them popped, as though marking the moment. You spoke true, he said at last, his voice low, steady as the earth itself. And you spoke enough. Her eyes burned, not with fear but with release, as though at last the weight she had carried since stepping from that stagecoach had lifted. By afternoon, the house stirred with a lighter air. Clara, sensing without words what had passed, bounded across the yard and clung to Eleanor's skirts, her braids bouncing against her back. Eleanor bent, smoothing them with careful fingers, her heart swelling with something that felt like both surrender and triumph. Jonas worked nearby, repairing the corral fence, but his eyes lingered often upon the two of them. When supper came, he drew up a chair, not the rocking chair that once guarded memory, but one beside it, plain and sturdy. He gestured toward it with the faintest nod. It's yours, if you'll have it, he said. Not an offer of chains, nor a plea for pity, but an invitation as bare and honest as the land they lived on. Eleanor met his gaze across the lamplight, and for the first time since her journey began, she did not feel like a guest or a burden. She felt, simply, present, wanted not out of duty but of choice. The days that followed carried them toward a quieter rhythm. The wagon rattled down the road one morning with all three aboard, Jonas steady at the reins, Eleanor beside him, Clara nestled between. The plains stretched wide and gold beneath a forgiving sun, the horizon clear after weeks of storm. In the bed of the wagon lay a sack of feed, a spool of thread, and a small bundle of ribbon Clara had begged from the mercantile. Nothing grand, nothing binding, yet everything that mattered. They rode in silence at first, the creak of wheels and the call of meadowlarks filling the space words could not. Then Clara leaned her head against Eleanor's arm, eyes half closed, safe. Jonas glanced sideways, the faintest trace of peace softening his scar. Eleanor's shawl lifted in the wind, and she let it, no longer clutching it as armor but letting it billow free. When they reached the cabin, the door stood open to the scent of fresh wood smoke. Inside, the rocking chair rested by the fire, no longer a monument to sorrow but a seat waiting to be shared. The sun sank behind the plains, painting the world in ember light. Within those walls, 3 lives, once splintered by grief, shame, and solitude, wove together not by vow nor by law, but by endurance, respect, and the tender courage of beginning again. And for Eleanor Harrow, the bride no one came for, the ride home had finally come to mean something truer, she had found not merely shelter, but belonging.